In Numbers 28, beginning at verse 16, it says, on the 14th day of the first month, which is Aviv, is the Passover of the Lord. And on the 15th day of this month is the feast. Unleavened bread, or matzah, shall be eaten for 7 days. And on the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work. Again, in Leviticus chapter 23, beginning at verse 6. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. And on the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it, but you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord for 7 days. And so this morning we are congregating to acknowledge this command that is given in regard to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. I have to admit that during the course of Unleavened Bread every year, I'm reminded of just how much I like donuts. It's not typical for me to go to Dunkin' Donuts or whatever when I'm just, going about my business and there's no special season. I don't even think anything about it, but somehow, some way, I don't know why, in the midst of unleavened bread, I'm thinking, I'd sure like to have a Dunkin' Donut right now. And I think in part that is one of the reasons that the Creator established a time that we were to deny ourselves this whatever it is. It's kind of like, gluten. I don't know what gluten is, but it's delicious. And I know that because I've eaten the gluten-free stuff. You know what I mean? Okay. And so there is just something about this leaven that is just very tasty and very appealing. And of course, I think most of you realize that the Creator, He established this to bring to our attention just how pervasive and just how aggressive a sinful nature can be. The things that we aren't supposed to have are the things that we want. You can eat of all of the trees in the garden, but this one tree, don't eat of it, because in the day that you eat of that tree, you will surely die. And so what is it they want when they had everything else out there? What is it they wanted? The one thing they were not supposed to have. I have to tell this story again, and I know most of you have heard it a million times by now, but it's just something that's going to be with me for the rest of my life. And it involves Brandon when he was a little guy. You've heard the story how, he's the first grandchild on both sides. And so my parents, Beth's parents, just, loaded him up with every kind of toy imaginable in the late 80s. And it's always been fascinating to me that, and he's not the only one, of course, but he wanted to play with the boxes and, never the toys, And we'd have toys scattered all over the living room, but he would play with boxes and things like that. Well, anyway, somebody had given Beth a living plant, and that had survived somehow or another, and she put it on the coffee table. We don't have green thumbs at our house, I'm sorry. But she put it on the coffee table in the living room, and we lived in Florida at the time, and the living room was kind of a sunken, it used to be a garage, and they converted it. Anyway, that was kind of a safe place to put Brandon when he was a little guy, because we could kind of keep him corralled. Well, he got interested in this plant, and he would pull himself up onto the coffee table to reach out and play with the plant. We'd tell him, no, don't play with the plant, leave it alone, no. All right? And so he has all these toys he can play with, but he's continually drawn to that plant. And so finally, one day I told him, you may freely play with all the toys in the living room, but of the plant that is in the midst of the coffee table, you shall not play with it. Neither shall you touch it. So one day, he's down there in the living room playing, little guy. And I see him working his way over to the coffee table. I've got a picture of this somewhere. And he pulls himself up onto the coffee table, and he looks at the plant, and he looks at me. He looks back at the plant, and he looks at me. And then he stuck out his hand toward the plant, watching me the whole time. And he got his hand as close to that plant as he could without touching it. And then looked at me as if to say, what you gonna do? Your play. So I popped his bottom. Where did he learn that? Where do we learn that? We were born with that inclination, that nature. And so the Creator, every year at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and not just the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but he makes this point that we have this inclination in us, this leaven, this chametz, this desire to have what we are told isn't good for us, at least for that season. And so throughout the 7 days as we eat matzah, I know that some people love it. I'm not a big fan. And the more I eat it, the more I realize how much I love donuts. But I'm also realizing just how much I need to suppress and to overcome that inclination within me that wants to do what the Creator says don't do or is not good for me. And so this week we are reminded that every day throughout the year, but particularly this week, we're going to be reminded to purge out the leaven, to purge out the chametz from our lives. And if we don't know what the chametz is still in our lives, the Creator has a way of making us aware of that, bringing us into situations that kind of draw those things out of us, that purge those things and bring them to the surface. And as he does that, we need to be willing to pay attention to what he's trying to tell us and to do what we need to do to rid our lives of those things, that we may be a holy people before the Lord. And so this week, and every day, but this week, once again, we learn to deny our fleshly cravings. We eat the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth, as Paul spoke of. In fact, I want to read from Paul's letter to the Corinthians in chapter 5, 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7. Therefore, purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed Messiah, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. And so in thanksgiving for the Messiah's sacrifice, we're striving to keep his commands because we love him. If you love me, keep my commandments. And so that's why we do these things. And thus, as it says in Exodus chapter 12, verse 15, 7 days, you shall eat unleavened bread. And on the first day, you shall remove leaven, chametz, from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. So I was reading this again, and I paused on that verse, and I read some commentary that elaborates on the notion of what it means to be cut off from Israel. The chametz was to be removed from the congregation, not just the individual's life, not just their home, but from the congregation at large, because the congregation was to be holy unto the Lord. So this congregation, which was to be holy, was to have chametz removed from it. And so Jewish tradition does not allow for even the tiniest bit of chametz to remain at Passover for the next 7 days. And I'm certain that most of you are familiar with the custom of the night before the Passover, of going through the house and searching for the leaven and making certain that every last morsel of chametz is removed from the house. Because it is understood, and I believe this is the point the Creator wants to make with us, just the least little bit of chametz has the ability to permeate and to pollute the entire lump. It's powerful, it's pervasive. It's like tares, it's the same principle. The tares are not content to remain in their field. The tares want to be sown in the midst of the wheat. Because the adversary is aggressive. He's unrelenting. He's always coming at you. He's always coming at God's purpose. He's always coming at God's people. And so it's very important that even though we have been forgiven of our sins and the Messiah has removed the guilt of our sin from our lives, it's still up to us to do what we're commanded to do to remove the presence of sin from our lives, to make sure that those things that we're inclined to do that aren't so healthy and profitable, that we are on guard against those things and are continually working to make certain that these little bits of yeast don't find their way back into our lives, because it is powerful, it's pervasive. And so just a small bit of the chametz mixed in with a much larger lump is forbidden. And that's why we are to rid our homes of these things. Because if we leave that there, if we leave that leaven in the dough, it's going to spread until the whole dough is corrupted. And so then, again, we're to purge this from our lives, to purge this from our homes. But we're also to purge this from the body. In fact, what we read here in 1 Corinthians, the context of Paul's admonition to purge out the old leaven was because there was a situation going on in that congregation that was not good. It was immorality. And he would say, look, this is present in your congregation. You need to get this out of the congregation, because if you don't, it's going to spread and it's going to permeate the entire body. Point is, whether it's in a person's life, a family, or in a congregation, the chametz, the sin, must be dealt with properly. We can't leave it unchallenged. It can't be excused. It can't be overlooked. Things can't be swept under the rug. Because if we do that, we can't think it's going to go away on its own. It's going to stay there. And rather than just being there dormant and doing nothing, content to just hang out in its own field, so to speak, it's going to grow and it's going to spread like leaven. So, this week, as we're embracing the principle of this moed, we must embrace the true intent of what the Creator wanted to convey to his people. Because this week is not about matzah recipes. You know, I heard the term the other day, matzah crack. I'm not exactly sure what that is, but people made it sound delicious. But this week is not about matzah recipes. It's not even about just getting together for fellowship, and I have no problems with that. But what this week is about is purging the leaven from our lives. So in Exodus 12, verse 16, on the first day, there shall be a holy convocation. That is the first day of unleavened bread, today. And on the seventh day, there shall be a holy convocation for you. No manner of work shall be done on them, but that which everyone must eat, and that only may be prepared by you. So you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. For on this same day, I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. And therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. And so something I want to amplify here, in conjunction with the removal of the leaven, the Creator emphasized that on the first day of unleavened bread, that's when he brought his people, his armies, out of the land of Egypt. I don't think he does anything by accident. And so there's a reason that he made that point. And so we go back in time and you think about all the things that are described for us, what was going on leading up to the Exodus from Egypt, all the different plagues, the encounters, the exchanges between Moses, Aaron, and Pharaoh and the magicians, and then the plagues are being poured out, and the effects of those plagues are accumulating. They're beginning to mount, because when one plague had this effect, when the next plague came, it built on the effect that the first one had, and so on and so on. Everything was mounting, everything was building, and probably for months. And even though there was a distinction placed between Egypt and between Israel, God's people observed everything that was going on around them. So not only was the pressure mounting on Pharaoh and his leaders and the people of Egypt, but I believe the anticipation among God's people was mounting as well. In other words, as they're watching all of this, and they know that eventually it is leading to something that God has promised, I can't help but think that there's times, there are days that they're asking themselves and they're praying, when is the decisive action going to come? Have you ever been in a situation that you knew, based on what the scripture said, based on what you feel like the Father has promised you in your spirit, that you knew he was going to do something. He was going to bring something to pass because it was right, it was just. And you see different things happening, and the anticipation of this is mounting, and it's mounting, and it's mounting, and we're waiting. And you ask yourself, ask him, when? Or is that just me? Or does that resonate with anybody? So imagine what they're thinking. When will the decisive action come? So then when that deliverance did come, what was promised, when it happened, it came very suddenly. We can spend months and months and months, even years and years and years. We've been waiting 2,000 years for the Messiah to return. And the anticipation of that grows and grows and grows. And as the birth pangs strike the earth and we see things going on and we know, well, it's got to be close. When is it going to happen? We've been doing this for 2,000 years. But one day, the king whom you seek is going to suddenly appear. And he's going to come in a time when we're not even expecting him to come. That's what he said. It's going to be in an hour when you're not thinking about it. But it's going to happen very suddenly. And so, of course, that is the pinnacle of what we anticipate. But right here and right now, in this world, in our lives, there are things that we are anticipating God to do on our behalf. And so as we purge out the leaven from our lives and show him we mean business, we anticipate that there will come a day that what he has promised will happen, and it will happen very suddenly. And when it does, that sudden action is going to require a quick response from all those who place their trust in the blood of the Lamb. So I want you now to consider how they ate the Passover, how they ate the unleavened bread. Exodus 12, verse 11. And thus you shall eat it, with the belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. So you shall eat it in haste, very hurriedly. It is the Lord's Passover. And so the Lord's Passover at the very beginning was something that was done very hurriedly, very quickly. We had to be able to respond. We had to be able to respond at a moment's notice. So they were to eat it ready to move with their staff in their hand, their shoes on their feet. And considering that this first day of unleavened bread is when he brought his armies out of the land of Egypt, staff in hand, shoes on feet, ready to go, their belt on their waist, suggests a military image to me. I mean, they didn't go to the table, then put on their shoes and eat and then get their staff. They went to the table with their staff in their hand, their shoes on their feet, their robe tucked into their belt, ready to move. Because when God says move, it's time to move, right? When God says do this, it's time to do this. When God says don't do that, don't do that. Now, this term with your belt on your waist, that's what the New King James says. But the King James Version says with your loins girded. So I was going to call this message with your, gird your loins, or excuse me, loin your girds. See, when I'm trying to do it wrong, I did it right. If you weren't here last night, you don't know what we're talking about. But he tells them they were to eat it with their loins girded. And so I thought I knew what that meant, but I thought, well, I'm going to look it up and just see what does this actually mean. And so the expression comes from tucking their long robe into a girdle or a belt. I prefer the word belt myself. Girdle just, anyway. Although sometimes I feel like I need one. But the idea was they would tuck their robe into their belt so it would not hamper any physical activity. They needed to move, and if they needed to move quickly, they don't want to be impeded with the robe, and having to deal with their skirt and all this kind of stuff. Makes sense to me. So generally speaking, to gird your loins means to prepare for action. And in this particular case, it was to tell them, be ready to move out at a moment's notice. It's really important when he says move to move. Because if you're running around town trying to find oil from merchants who are in the bed, you're probably not going to make it into the wedding chamber. So we have to be prepared. We have to listen today to what he's telling us so that we'll be prepared tomorrow when the order comes. So be prepared for action. Be prepared to move out. Elijah girded his loins when he ran before Ahab's chariot to the gates of Jezreel. So that to me, well, I will save that for later perhaps. But anyway, Elijah the prophet had to gird his loins. And if God is raising up a people who are in the spirit, going forth in the spirit and the power of Elijah, it seems to me that there comes a point in time they have to gird their loins. Because you see, if these are the days of Elijah, then we need to understand these are also the days of Jezebel. If he is sowing wheat in his field, then the adversary is going to try to sow tares in the wheat. Redemption is always going to come during a time of testing and trial. And so, Elijah had to gird his loins, and he outran Ahab's chariots all the way to Jezreel. I want you to consider another example of this expression. This comes from the book of Job, and this comes after Job has been listening to his friends who have come by to tell him about all of the things that he's doing wrong. And, there's this back and forth. But finally in Job chapter 38, verse 1, the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. And he said, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? May I paraphrase what I think he's saying there? Who is this who's flapping their gums and they don't know what they're talking about? Does that sound like a good translation to you? You ever met people who flap their gums and they don't know what they're talking about? It's bad, though, when we start listening to people who don't know what they're talking about. So who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now, prepare yourself is the way the New King James puts it. But here's the way it actually should be rendered. Now, gird up your loins like a man, Job, and I'm going to question you, and you are going to answer me. Here's what the creator of the universe is saying to Job. This man who is righteous, he's pious, he sacrifices, and yet when all these things happen, he's like, woe is me, I should have never been born, all these kind of things. And then he would bounce back, I know that my Redeemer lives, but whoa, I wish I'd never even exited my mother's womb, et cetera, and why are you doing this to me? And then the friends come by, and all this kind of stuff. So finally, here's what the creator says to Job, man up. You think you know everything? You think you got it figured out? Man up, Job. Gird up your loins like a man, and I'm going to ask you some questions, and you better give me some answers. If God tells you to man up, you better pay attention. I'm saying this because I know I'm not the only one. We all, at times, when we're going through things, we're asking God why. Why did this have to happen? Why is this? And why just wish this? And all these other kinds of things. As if we have everything all figured out. And we listen to those friends and we argue with them. We go back and forth and we silence them for a while and they silence us for a while. And so finally, God did get involved. And Job had wanted to argue with God about why this and why that. And so God granted his wish. All right, let's talk about it. Man up, Job. Because God was about to put him to a task that was going to require all of his ability. So then, to gird up your loins means that we are going to have to be prepared to do something that's very difficult. What Israel was preparing to do as they left, they were rejoicing as they were leaving Egypt. It didn't take long for that rejoicing to turn into other things, right? Because they had to go through very difficult situations, whereby they had to really place their trust in the Almighty. So to gird up your loins, again, is about preparing to do something that is very difficult. Sometimes it can even be dangerous because sometimes, very often in the Bible, it's associated with going to battle. That then brings us to the notion that Israel, as they're coming out of Egypt, was regarded as armies. Because not only were they being released from bondage, but they were being drafted into service. They were being drafted into service to go to war on behalf of the kingdom of righteousness, the kingdom of God, to contend with the kingdom of darkness. And that's a fight. That's a war, that's a battle, and so we have to gird up our loins in order to do that. We have to take that staff, that authority that he's given us under the kingship of the Messiah to trample on scorpions and serpents. It's not going to be easy. It isn't easy, but that is what we have been called to do. Now, I want to skip ahead in Israel's story and go from when the time they're coming out of Egypt as armies, as it were, and we're going to read from the book of Joshua, and this, what we're going to read today from, or portions of it, is actually the Haftarah for the first day of unleavened bread. And the Haftarah for the first day of unleavened bread actually begins in Joshua chapter 3, verses 5 through 7. I'm not going to read all of it, but in that short little bit, the people were to sanctify themselves in preparation for God to do something. He was getting ready to act. He was getting ready to move. They were going to see his wonders, and they had to sanctify themselves in preparation for that. And then in verse 7, it says this, "And the Lord said to Joshua, 'This day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you.'" Then the next portion of Joshua that is read is in chapter 5, starting with verse 2. It goes all the way over to the first verse of chapter 6, and then the verse at the end, or toward the end of chapter 6, verse 27. Again, I'm not going to read all of this. But if you were to read that, I would recommend that you do. It records how the men of Israel had to circumcise themselves before observing the Passover. They'd been in the wilderness all this time, and all the men of war who came out of Egypt, those armies that came out, who ate the Passover in Egypt, all those men of war had died in the wilderness. And those born in the wilderness had not been circumcised. So now they're emerging from the wilderness, they're coming into the land, and so in Joshua chapter 5, verse 9, it picks up and it says this, "Then the Lord said to Joshua, after this circumcision, 'This day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you.' Therefore the name of the place is called Gilgal till this day. Now the children of Israel camped in Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at twilight on the plains of Jericho. And they ate of the produce of the land on the day after the Passover, unleavened bread and parched grain on the very same day. Then the manna ceased on the day after they had eaten the produce of the land, and the children of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate the food of the land of Canaan that year." So there comes a day when we will no longer have to eat the bread of affliction, but we'll enjoy the bounty of the promise that God has made to us. But if we're going to do that, we're going to have to gird our loins, so to speak. And until that day comes, we're going to have to continually purge the leaven from our lives. But there does come a day when the reproach of Egypt is rolled off of us. Now, I believe when we're born again, all of that stuff that used to be is in the past. We are a new creation. And I am going to make the assumption that everybody in this room, hopefully everybody that's watching this on the live stream, has already made that decision to be born again. But I'm certain that everybody agrees with me that when we were born again, that's just when everything got started. Because being born again means we're a little infant and we cry and we need milk and we need a lot of care. But there comes a time that if he has to part the mustache to get the bottle in your mouth, there's a problem. In other words, there's a time that I believe he says to all of us, man up. Whether male or female, man up. Gird your loins. And do what I've asked you to do so that the reproach of Egypt can be rolled away. We are to be that new lump. That's what Paul was saying. You need to purge out the old leaven because you are a new lump. The Messiah has been sacrificed for you. So let's be what we're supposed to be. Let's be what we truly are. And let's not go back and dabble in Egypt of things that used to be that are gone. Let's don't go back there. Because that new lump is who we truly are because the Messiah is our Passover. And so then we are likewise reminded, in this passage is from Joshua, that we are here to fight. They kept the Passover on the plains of Jericho. The obstacle, the fortification, their next appointment was within sight. And within that fortification, there was an enemy that had to be overcome. And so they kept the Passover sore, hurting, but recovering, with the obstacle, with the objective in sight. So we are reminded that we're here to fight. We're not here to just lollygag. We are here to contend for the kingdom of heaven. And it has been, and it will be wearisome. And the adversary, as I said, is relentless. And so we, under the kingship of the Messiah, have to be just as relentless. Because if we're following him, if we're standing on what is true, then not even the gates of hell will be able to prevail against us. But that objective is not met if we're just sitting on our hands and we have not girded our loins. We have to be prepared to move. We have to be prepared to fight. The fight is foreboding. Jericho's a big obstacle. However, Joshua chapter 5, verse 13. And it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" You ever ask God that question? You ever said, "Are you for us or are you for them?" That's what Joshua did. So he said, "No, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshiped and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" Then the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take your sandal off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy." So everybody knows who this commander is, right? And he said, "But as the commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." And he's got his sword drawn. And Joshua did so. He took his sandals off and he worshiped. And then in verse 1 of chapter 6, the very next thing it says, "Now Jericho was securely shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out and none went in." You know what that tells me? That the fear and dread of God's people fell upon those in that fortification. They were not going out. They were not coming in. In fact, Rahab later confirms, for 40 years we've been expecting y'all. Not because of who they were, but because of who called them and who appointed them, who anointed them to be his people. And he met them on the plains of Jericho with his sword drawn to lead them into the battle. But if we're going to follow him, we have to gird up our loins. So I'm choosing to believe that all that you have endured in times past, all that I've endured in times past, all of us together, those things that we are enduring right now, individually, corporately, all of those things are not without value. Because more and more, and this is my prayer for everybody here that is part of this congregation and in the body at large, but more and more as adversity is presented to us, more and more we're learning to fight instead of taking flight. Because in times past, and this is my very strong opinion, you're entitled to disagree with it if you wish, but I have the microphone right now, so I'll state my opinion. In this walk, in this movement, not just in the Hebrew Roots community, but even across the board in my experience in churches, when adversity comes, there are too many people who are quick to take flight. If we are going to be God's people, those who overcome by the blood of the Lamb, the word of our testimony, and love not our lives even unto death, we cannot be so quick to take flight. We need to stand and to fight. And so we've heard this all of our lives. But the day is coming, and now is, when I believe it must be something we embrace wholeheartedly, and that is we are to take on the whole armor of God. Why? So that we will be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. And so if we do not take on the whole armor, it implies we will not be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. And Paul even says this, having your loins girt about with truth. Because you see, falsehood and lies and accusation, because he is the accuser of the brethren. That is our adversary. That's what he does. And he is unrelenting. He's aggressive. He never goes to sleep. He's always at work, and he's always at minions at work. And so when we are girt with truth, that truth is going to stand. By the way, the truth does not need to be defended. The truth is. And so, in other words, let's man up for the fight. Yes, our adversary is relentless. He's very aggressive. But that doesn't mean we have to be passive. We have a shield of faith. And we need to make certain that shield of faith is there to repel all these arrows and all these darts that the adversary is throwing at us. In battle, we cannot be passive about righteousness. We have to wield the sword of the Spirit that cuts asunder. It's able to divide asunder bone and marrow, soul and spirit. We need to know what that word says and to wield the sword of the Spirit because we are in a battle. So then, in anticipation of what is to come in my life, what is to come in your life, what the Father has prepared for us to do individually as a congregation, let's consider then what this season is about. Yes, purge out the leaven. All that stuff that is unfruitful, unprofitable, those things that try to rise and tries to spread throughout our life, that tries to rise and spread throughout our family, that tries to rise and spread throughout our communities and congregations. We need to be actively purging that, to go on a search and make sure that we haven't left one nook or cranny unchecked, to make certain that all those things are purged out of our lives. And again, if we're not sure where it's at, he has a way of bringing it to our attention. So then, let's do that, and when necessary, be prepared to do battle, which I am, with every passing day, growing to believe is going to be an everyday event in some way or the other. Maybe it's the man in the mirror that I'm looking at in the morning. Sometimes it's more than that. But every day is going to be a battle. Every day is going to be a fight. And so we can't put our sword down. We still need to work. We still need to do the things that he's called us to do. And so we have to be like Nehemiah and all those that were restoring the walls of Jerusalem. We have a tool in one hand, but we got a weapon in the other. We've got to be ready to, while we're doing the work, when something arises, to pivot and to fight when necessary. Because Sanballat wants to get into the midst of what we're doing and to destroy it. And so then, one day, throughout this process, there's going to come a suddenly. And God is going to act. And we're going to move. And as we're moving, it will be as an army. And it will be with rejoicing and celebration. And so then, until then, Brandon, I need you to come on up here. I thought you were making your way up here. Come here. Luke chapter 12. Verse 35. Messiah says, let your waist be girded and your lamps burning. And you yourselves be like men who wait for their master when he will return from the wedding, that when he comes and knocks, they may open to him immediately. Now I read that and then I think of what we see in Revelation about the congregation of Laodicea. The door is closed and the master's knocking on the door. Here he's saying you need to have your waist girded, your loins girded, if you will, and be ready to open to him immediately. Blessed are those servants whom the master, when he comes, will find watching, alert, paying attention, sober. Assuredly, I say to you that he will gird himself and have them sit down to eat and will come and serve them. And then in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 13, therefore, gird up the loins of your mind. Because a lot of these battles that we have are mind battles. Would you agree? And so we have to gird up the loins of your mind, Peter says. Be sober and rest your hope fully upon the grace that is brought to you at the revelation of Yeshua the Messiah, the author and the finisher of our faith, the captain of the Lord's hosts. As obedient children, not conforming yourselves to the former lusts, not going back to Egypt, as in your ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, because it is written, be holy, for I am holy.